for our debate, and it is open. I have to tell you that we have a transmission on internet, and we can have questions on the internet, and that's because why I have my computer. It's not a Magalhães, it's my laptop, and the questions are directly on my lap. But I want your questions too. I would like to ask you to identify yourselves and to ask questions. The more objective, the merrier. You can comment, of course, but I would like to ask you not to make big speeches so that we can finish our session at a time 7:45, which was the time that was scheduled. Please, first intervention. I can't see because of the light. I would like to ask you for help to tell me who asked first, but you must ask at the microphone. Okay, you can speak in Portuguese because there's translation. Well, good night. I loved both interventions. It is really good to be here, so I thank the opportunity. I'm Amilcar Coelho, as director of Alcobaça and Lole institution. In the United States, you had an experience of direct learning, teaching to poorer children that I thought was constructivism that affected the performance of that direct study. So what I want to ask to countries like Portugal, maybe it's more, we need to impose the method of science teaching. This is very a sensitive problem. Should we impose a method of teaching by the teachers, a direct one? This is very important for us Portuguese, is the facilitation issue. We have talked about this in the 50s, and you talked about it in the States in the 50s, but you need 60 more years to talk about this. We must increase the demand, as Margarida Afonso said. But maybe, do you think you can do this without training the teachers, namely science teachers? This is the question and the issue I bring. We won't speak about the theoretical point of view. We must know what you will do in the practical point of view, without preventing that the poor and can see at school a window to the opportunity. Maybe directly, Klahr can answer the question. First of all, if one type of education is preferable against another, and the issue of the demand by the teachers.
Okay, there was a lag in the translation. Well, you asked a lot of questions, and I think you're asking a question about what should we do tomorrow. We can't wait for 30 more years of research. I think that the thing to do tomorrow is to question and try to be, in the classroom, try to be somewhat skeptical about received wisdom, about assertions that this is better than that, while the research base is building up. I think it's going to take a long time for the research base to build up. And as I often say that I think the education sciences right now are in a state that medicine, the field of medicine, was in 150 years ago. There are lots of activities that practitioners went through, and half of them were wrong. They were witchcraft, essentially, and the other half were quite effective. And the problem is we didn't know which ones were which. And I think there's a lot of practices in education where we have been told we ought to do something a certain way, and we can't be sure that that's the right way. So I can only suggest that we try to infuse the education process with more and more rigorous research. And those questions have to be fairly focused. I don't think there's a universal answer here. There are probably many contexts in which open-ended, constructivist types of learning are going to be very effective. There are probably many areas where direct instruction isn't going to work very well, but we need to find out which they are. Right now, since medicine has advanced for 150 years, we have hundreds and thousands of different kinds of drug remedies and procedures on the market and in practice because they're based on research, and they've replaced the old witch doctor. And I think that's where we can hope that education sciences move in the next 100 years.
Muito bem. Novas perguntas?
Any further questions?
Olá, boa tarde. Antes de mais, também uma palavra de agradeçimento.
Hello, good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank the foundation and the organizers for having enabled this opportunity. My name is Miguel Martins.
Chamo Miguel Martinho.
I'm Miguel Martinho. I'm a music teacher. I teach music.
Eu acredito.
So I believe that music can be taught through experimental knowledge. We just can think about the acoustic phenomenon. I believe that was a poor example, but my question is the following. Do you agree? Because there are many phenomena in terms of sound, the changes of tones, and so it's very important that children understand in an experimental way the changes of sound. So my question is, do you agree that we teach in an experimental way the music, that we teach music in an experimental way? But in music we have a problem, you know, when we want to put all the children to experiment, it becomes a problem.
Outra questão.
Any further questions?
Tenho aqui uma questão que...
I have a question I just received from the internet. So how should we introduce experimental knowledge or education of sciences in kindergarten? How can we start introducing the education of sciences in the kindergarten? Maybe Professor Klahr can give us a clue on this.
Well, I think at the kindergarten level, you can try to show children very simple contrasts. You can show them the difference between, you know, one kind of activity and another and its effect on what changes or whether something heats up, and try to guide them to realize that if they have a hypothesis, if they think that something is true, if there's a way to find out about it, they might actually include some simple confounds in their first approach. You might also want to get them to understand that if you're trying to identify what caused what, that there might be other things that caused it. You might try to point them out and kind of carefully show them that what they thought was the true cause of something actually could have been caused by a couple of things, and get them to sort of think about that while not overloading their capacity.
Há problema no som. E temos aqui é uma experiência.
No, we have a sound problem now.
Talvez a professora Margarida Afonso quer dizer qualquer coisa sobre...
So I think Margarida Afonso can say something about the kindergarten, because Margarida Afonso, she also teaches at the kindergarten. Jardim de Infância, kindergarten. There are many similarities about the introduction of sciences in the kindergarten about compared to other schooling years. There are some principles that must be respected at all levels, even in the kindergarten or even in any school level. There's a lot of work done at that level. We can introduce experimental knowledge at a very early age, in simple ways, of course, by using the senses. There are many, many ways of introducing that. Let me tell you that from the work I've developed in the kindergarten, I've found very, very interested teachers, and the, teachers that really want to develop accurate scientific education, of course with simple language, but in a very accurate way. And this is very desirable. This is very much desired. It's very much desired that we start the education of science at those levels. It's just that that has not become a general practice yet. Any further questions?
Please feel free to come forward. You just have to wait for the roaming mic. Hello? It's not really a question, it's a comment more. It's about secondary education. My name is Miguel Simões. I teach in Odmira at the secondary school. And a problem we have there, and I must say that I really love experimental knowledge, experimental learning, but how can we use it? How can we, well, reinforcing the idea from Miguel, a music teacher, how can we do it with many, many students in, let's say, a classroom has 20 plus, so even if we divide it in two, we have about like 14 students in each group. So then how can we teach them experimental sciences? And then we don't have materials also. We don't have any of those materials that come in the textbooks, for instance, and those materials that are recommended. So how can we overcome these two problems that we have? For instance, in my school is in Odmira. Odmira means in the interior of the Alentejo. Alentejo is like one of the poorest regions in Portugal. So it's okay, anyone wants to comment? This is a very Portuguese issue. So lack of material, big classrooms, so how can we overcome this? Well, in terms of material, there is some specific material in secondary school. And this requires a certain amount of care. But material is not the main issue for experimental education. In primary education, well, it's not at all the problem, the issue. Now, I must say that often the difficulty teachers have in terms of experimental knowledge is because they themselves didn't have training. They themselves didn't receive any training. So if we look at their training, what type of experimental knowledge did they receive? What type of experimental training did they receive? So these gaps are carried, these shortcomings are carried by teachers, and then they have difficulties in teaching experimental sciences to their students. And then, of course, the curricular also makes things more complicated. But I think there are ways, then we can speak in more detail, but I think there are ways of going about this, for instance, developing some very basic practical activities. I don't also advocate many experimental activities. No, a few, but well done. They must be well done. That's a very important point. Professor Clark, do you want to add something?
Let me answer your question myself. One way to teach a whole class, and that is a challenge without the right physical materials, is simply to put up a big, I don't know if you have access to PowerPoint, but simply sort of give a lecture to the whole class on the kinds of experimental setups that I was describing, and pause and say, do you think you could tell for sure? And then basically replicate the kind of procedure that we used with physical materials just by stopping and asking the children if they think they could find out what caused the ball to roll down further, and then say, no, you're wrong, or no, you're right. And so that's one kind of methodology and technology. It's sort of one teacher standing in front of the whole class and there's no hands-on at all, but a lot of talking back and forth. The other extreme, which is already out there, is to use the internet. There's many websites where you can go and get access to pretty interesting, animated experimental designs. Kids drag a beaker and they pour it into the water and something blows up. And you do need the facility. You need to have access to the internet and you need to have a working computer, and that's the big challenge, I realize. But just a slide presentation on the one hand and an active dynamic interaction on the other might allow you to approach these issues in the classroom, even without a lot of resources. And eventually these things are going to be apps on people's iPhones for doing experimental science in the classroom.
Muito bem, obrigado. Está aqui outra questão.
Any further questions?
Boa noite, Marco Gomes, professor.
Hello, I'm Marco Gomes. I teach biology and geology. So my question is the following. Now, without being a provocation, I want to say the following. It's important to reflect on shifts and the need for shifts. I think that lately there is information that because of budget constraints, there are no shifts. And this is very concerning, especially for those that work with very different students, students with different types of shortcomings. So my question is the following. Despite the fact that David Klahr said that there are other tools, other possible tools that can be used in the classroom without being the physical objects to interact with students. Well, at present, students that the students I've had these years, even PowerPoint or tools like things that come, Brick is an interactive tool that we use with the internet. Even in our days, these tools, many students don't like it. It's boring for them. So unless there is handling of materials, there are things that we cannot achieve. There is a curiosity that is not explored. So I think it's fundamental that part actually happens, you know, the more practical side. And then shifts is also fundamental. So I would like to hear a feedback from both speakers on this. And without abusing from your patience, I think it's very relevant to have here with us the Minister of Education and Science, so that he, if he thinks it's timely, to also comment on this subject matter. And what are the future perspectives on this? Thank you. This is it. Thank you.
So you got the question.
That's an excellent question. The one word kept getting translated as shifts. I'm not sure quite what he meant by something shifting. I don't know what the what?
Splitting the class.
Oh, okay. One of the assertions you made about the effectiveness of hands-on physical manipulation of materials versus virtual presentations on the computer screen. That's actually an open question right now. It's a researchable question, and there has been some research on it. I've done a little bit in my lab, and others have, where we give students exactly the same training, but in one case they're physically moving ramps and they're touching stuff. In the other case, it's just point and click, point and click. And what we found in two very different studies is there's no effect, there's no difference. Children learn just as much when they're not manipulating the materials. Now, we found this in a study we did with the ramps and sinking objects, and you might say, well, those are kind of boring, and it's not surprising that, you know, doing it on the screen doesn't differ from rolling the ball down the ramp. But we've also done it in a situation where the children were assembling little race cars that they would wind up, and the cars would run down the corridor, and they would see which car would go the furthest. Very physical, very tactile, lots of sensory feedback. And then we did the same test where they point and click and assemble the pieces of a car, and then it runs across the screen in a very kind of simplified, pathetic animation. And then we measured what they learned. They learned just as much. I was actually surprised at that. So there may be many domains where you have to have your hands on something, and the materials are expensive and they're cumbersome, and you can't get the kit because, you know, the materials didn't come properly. But there's many domains where computerization and virtualization, putting those things on screens, is going to have very little educational effect, and it's going to be very cheap and very effective. Again, it's an empirical question about where that breaks down and where it holds true, but it's not universally true that hands-on is always better, even in science.